Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you one and all to the City of Port Phillip Remembrance Day virtual live event for 2020. I'd particularly like to welcome any newly elected councillors who are with us today and former councillors who may be present. My name is Janet Belitho and I'm a member of the City of Port Phillip's Second World War Commemorative Committee and a member of the Port Melbourne Historical and Preservation Society. Before we begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Yalukit Willem clan of the Bunwurrung. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to this land. 2020 marks the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, and this commemoration forms a key part of our remembering today, especially through the sharing of people's stories of the war years in our city. Of course, we had hoped to meet in person at our Remembrance Garden in Port Melbourne, as we've done in previous years, but to maintain a COVID-safe event, we're meeting virtually. Now, as we go through the service today, there'll be transitions between one recording and another. Please take those transitions as a time to pause, to be quiet and to reflect on what we've heard. The Honourable Ted Baillieu was to have delivered our keynote address this year in the Remembrance Garden. Some of you may remember his powerful address at the Anzac Centenary in 2015. He's kindly adapted to our online format and provided this brief message in support of our event. Mr. Baillieu was Premier of Victoria from 2010 to 2013, and since April 2013, he has been the chair of the Victorian Government's Anzac Centenary Committee. Thank you, Mr. Baillieu.
Ted Baillieu speaking to you as former Premier and former Chairman of Victoria's Anzac Centenary Committee. And can I thank the City of Port Phillip for their extraordinary contribution to the Anzac Centenary. And we will never forget that more than 7,000 original Anzacs came from St Kilda, South Melbourne and Port Melbourne alone. What we learned from the Anzac Centenary is that in the course of commemoration, the most powerful thing we can do is to make contemporary connections to those who served and sacrificed. Those connections may be of service or, of course, of family, but also of community, churches, sporting clubs, and of institutions, of schools, universities, and of occupations, and especially places, suburbs, streets, homes. Now, the digitisation of Australia's very good World War I records ensured making those connections was possible. If you live in the City of Port Phillip and in a home that's more than 100 years old, chances are your home was once occupied by an original Anzac. Now, it's horrifying to think that just 20 years after World War I commemorations, we will be marking the centenary of World War II. Australia's World War II records are not as complete as World War I and are not yet fully digitised, but we do hope that that process will be completed in time for the centenary. Nevertheless, these connections are just as important as they ever were, no matter how we access them. Now, Remembrance Day provides that the world has an annual commemorative ritual, originally recalling World War I, but now with wider meaning. We wear the poppies, we hear and say, lest we forget, and we respond, we will remember them. Now, we may not be able to be together this year in person, but the mission is just as important as ever. We must do more than just perform the rituals. But to remember, we must connect. Local and personal stories are essential. Now, the City of Port Phillip is to be congratulated for its online project, which they have titled Through Childhood Eyes, Hidden Stories of World War II. This marks the 75th anniversary of the end of the war, and it reminds us all of the impact of war on those at home, no matter where those homes were. The project begins this public process of reviving and making those contemporary connections to those who served and suffered in World War II. Lest we forget, we must connect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bailey, for that address. As Mr. Bailey mentioned, the City of Port Phillip was successful in its application to the Victorian Government's 75th anniversary of the end of World War II grants program. Through Childhood Eyes, Hidden Stories of World War II collected 16 stories of the war years. It was a meaningful way to commemorate the significant anniversary by documenting the war's impact on young people. Young people in the City of Port Phillip now were invited to read out these stories to form the audio that you will see here soon. The project was recorded and produced under COVID restrictions, a layer of complexity that thankfully didn't put anyone off participating in the project. The City of Port Phillip acknowledges the support of the Victorian Government. The Honourable Sean Lean, Minister for Local Government and for Veterans, has asked that this message be read, and I will do that. Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Bunurong people, the traditional owners of the land where you're meeting. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be present here today. I'd also like to acknowledge any newly elected councillors who may be present, any former councillors. Peter Smith, the CEO of the City of Port Phillip, the Honourable Ted Bailey, Lieutenant Colonel Graham Lockwood, OAM, RFD, EB, retired, all members of the City of Port Phillip's World War II Commemorative Committee, and the 16 locals who shared their World War II stories, and to the students from Middle Park Primary School and Albert Park Secondary College who recited the stories. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, a significant milestone to acknowledge, especially as many of our surviving World War II veterans are in their early to late 90s. While COVID-19 disrupted our original program to hold live commemorative services and exhibitions this year, as we traditionally would, the Victorian Government is proud that so many of its plans were presented online so everyone could commemorate the significant anniversary at home. Today I'm pleased to see that the City of Port Phillip, a successful applicant of the Victorian Government's 75th anniversary of the end of World War II grants program, was able to pivot its program and present it virtually, which you will experience today. In supporting the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, the Victorian Government aimed to highlight the lesser known or untold stories of what occurred across Victoria. The City of Port Phillip's soundscape project, titled Through Childhood Eyes, Hidden Stories of World War II, aligns with the government's key objective of telling untold stories, which is well captured by portraying the impact of World War II through the lens of young children who were living in the former cities of Port Melbourne, South Melbourne and St Kilda at the time. I commend the City of Port Phillip for their extensive research to locate 16 men and women who grew up in suburbs from Elwood to Port Melbourne, and they're tasked to capture their stories of living through the war as young children. As we approach Remembrance Day, the launch of this project is fitting as we reflect and remember the sacrifice and service of World War II and all veterans and their families who greatly contributed towards the freedoms we enjoy today. I conclude by officially launching Through Childhood Eyes, Hidden Stories of World War II, and I congratulate the City of Port Phillip and everyone involved in crafting this soundscape through this year's challenging circumstances and your key efforts in keeping local history alive. Thank you. Thank you, Minister Leen. We'd also like to thank the students from Middle Park Primary School and Albert Park Secondary College for bringing these stories to life. And they are Tristan Carr, River Collis, Felix Cornwall, Ayla Dury, Charlie Fortunato, Scarlett Grieve, Lilly Hall, Yasmin Jenkins, Chloe Cascani, Georgia Cascani, Matilda Lester, Fox McMaster, Holiday Ott, Freddie Stevens, Miller Stevens, and Ella Strangwood. So we'll now hear the soundscape.
Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war. I know that in spite of the emotion we are all feeling, you will show that Australia is ready to see it through. May God in his mercy and compassion grant the world may soon be delivered from this agony.
My parents and I were at Flinders Street Station. Paper boys were calling out, "Special edition, special edition." War has been declared on Germany. I was sitting on my dad's shoulders when he said, "Oh no, not again."
I never felt scared, but there was this overwhelming sense that the war was never going to end.
My mother shopped for bargains at the South Melbourne market late on Friday nights or at the end of the day on Sundays. I loved the meals she cooked with those cheap cuts of meat. She would make offal, lamb's fry, tripe, kidneys, and oxtail. It was delicious.
Most of the time, the war felt really far away. There were hardly any toys or treats. It was really hard not knowing when it would all end.
The ration books ran out really fast in our house. Mum sometimes relied on the local black market to get extra supplies to feed our large family. Lots of other people in Port Melbourne did that too.
There were shortages in rubber during the war, so we didn't have tennis balls or footballs. But we still played sports. We used to roll up newspapers into a ball and tie strings around it. We would wet it and the paper would expand into a makeshift football.
Every Friday lunchtime, my friends and I would go and watch the soldiers marching down Swanston Street, heading off to join the war. We had little Australian flags we made to wave and cheer them on. It was quite exciting.
My two older brothers left for the war. They both joined the RAAF.
In Montague, we always knew when the troop train was coming through, and people would put logs on the track to delay it, so that the boys could say an extra goodbye.
We would watch the train going down to Station Pier. Men would throw down letters and notes for wives and girlfriends. I caught one and delivered it to a woman in South Melbourne.
My father and our two uncles all enlisted in the war, but we never talked about the war at home.
My parents talked about the war with me. When I asked my mother questions about what I had heard, she would get out a newspaper to connect what I heard on the radio with what was happening. She also showed me maps and photos.
I was very scared. I remember hearing the drone of planes overhead and Mum saying it was only the seagulls. But I knew that it wasn't.
You heard people talking. They thought you weren't listening, but you were. Sometimes we didn't understand it all, and we'd get frightened.
My father enlisted in the war. He used to write to me and say how much he was looking forward to hearing me play a particular piece of music on the piano. I was really worried he would be disappointed I couldn't play it, because I was more interested in playing hockey than practicing piano.
My dad decided to dig a shelter in our backyard. He dug so deep, he nearly hit the sewage pipe. Luckily, I yelled at him to stop just in time.
When you saw the telegram boy coming down the road, you knew it was bad news. Everybody knew.
Every Sunday night we would all sit around the kitchen table and listen to the stories or plays on the wireless. That was a real treat.
We lived on Gladstone Street. My mother would make a pot of pea soup every Sunday. Any of the local men who were home for a visit knew they were welcome to drop in and have a bowl. She often took packages and food to the training camp up at Puckapunyal.
I would knit scarves for war effort and can remember practicing drills for air raids, marching across the oval to the trench at the back of Knott Street School.
We had to get into the trenches to do drills at school. I actually had my first kiss in those trenches during a drill in grade 5. I was so surprised when it happened.
My friends and I used to enjoy playing in the air raid trenches at Crichton Reserve.
Mum wouldn't let my sister and I near the air raid shelters on Raglan Street. She said that bad men would hang around there.
My dad was the local air raid warden for Montague. He walked along the street with his special warden's hat and armband. He would blow his whistle to call people out to the streets and teach them how to handle fires. I used to help him. I remember us being in the middle of the road in Buckhurst Street.
We moved to Elwood during the war. I would help my mother with her first aid and home nursing course, winding bandages in the living room. I even volunteered as a patient during training days, lying on the ground while Mother demonstrated bandaging techniques.
My dad worked as a proofreader for The Age. During the war years, he was asked to report on the Victorian football games. I would go with him to the games. Then, on Sunday mornings, it was my job to ride my bike to South Melbourne Station and hand in the reports to the train guard who would then deliver them to The Age.
I started my first job at 15. I had to learn it all in a week because so many of the other staff members were going off to enlist in the war.
It is our privilege tonight to introduce the Prime Minister, the Honourable John Curtin. Ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister.
Men and women of Australia, we are at war with Japan. For the first time in the history of the Pacific, armed conflict stalks abroad. One thing remains, and on it depends our very lives. That thing is the cooperation, the strength, and the willpower of you, the people of the Commonwealth. Without it, we are indeed lost. Men and women of Australia, the call is to you for your courage, your physical and mental ability, your inflexible determination that we as a nation of free people shall survive. My appeal to you is in the name of Australia, for Australia is the stake in this conflict. The thread of peace has snapped. Only the valour of our fighting forces, that be the very uttermost of which we are capable in factory and workshop, can knit that thread again into security. Let there be no idle hand. The road of service is ahead. Let us all tread it firmly, victoriously.
I remember that day. We were crossing Port Phillip Bay. The band that was playing on the paddle steamer suddenly stopped, and the captain announced that Australia was at war with Japan. That was the day Jack and I fell in love.
We were given a haversack at school one day and told to go home and pack a change of clothes and toiletries. We had a form we had to get our parents to sign in case we were told to evacuate to the country while we were at school. We practiced marching from school to the train station.
I don't know if my mother thought the Japanese were going to march down Nightingale Street where we lived, but she refused to sign the form. Instead, she took my brother and me away to Mount Evelyn, which was about 20 miles from St Kilda.
One night, my father came home late from work and told me to come outside. I can remember standing on the street in the dark, looking up, and I saw a plane fly over, right over the top of Dunlop's in the railway station. It had a big red sun on the side. My father said, "Don't tell anyone at school about this."
When they thought the Japanese were coming, we weren't allowed to have any lights on at night. We covered the windows with paper because we were close to the port. My sister and I slept together in a big bed, and we were scared of the dark.
We lived next door to a former South Melbourne footballer, Len Thomas. I can still see that day in my mind, the day we were told he was killed. It was just like the Japanese were suddenly just up the street. I had no idea of geography, but New Guinea seemed really close. That was the only time I was scared, realizing that his kids, Barry and Lynette, now had no father.
My sister and I, along with our brother and sister, were sent to Mount Evelyn to live with our grandmother, while Mum stayed behind in Port Melbourne.
I can remember being very scared that the Japanese would invade. My cousin and I made a plan to run away if they did. We loaded up our toys and dolls into a cart with socks and shoes, although we didn't pack any food.
I remember hearing about the Japanese submarine in Sydney Harbour. That was really scary.
I started working for the army when I was 15. The thought of a Japanese invasion was a vague concept and hard to really imagine happening. On the other hand, knowing there was a murderer killing women in Albert Park and near where I lived was very real. I was very uneasy about that. Because we worked long hours and would often leave after dark, the army would organise cars or taxis to take us home during that time.
We always walked there, right along Auckland Street, and there would always be a long queue of American soldiers with their girlfriends waiting to get into the Galleon Coffee Lounge. Many of them would use their wait time to get more familiar with each other, making the most of their time together. As a young girl, I was spellbound.
I went up to Bay Street from school at lunchtime, and I remember seeing all the American troops marching down Bay Street towards the Port Melbourne football ground. They were yelling out to the women in the streets, "Where are we?" because they had gotten straight off the ship and had no idea where they had arrived.
The American soldiers were just larger than life. I'd only ever seen Americans in films, and suddenly they were everywhere in St Kilda. Sometimes they would share chewing gum or even Coca-Cola with us local kids.
I remember coming home from school one day and going into my room as normal. Suddenly, I saw a pair of feet sticking out from under my bed. I ran screaming from the room, only to learn it was my brother, home on leave from the army, playing a trick on me.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Australia,
Mr. J.B. Chifley.
Fellow citizens, the war is over. Let us remember those whose lives were given that we may enjoy this glorious moment and may look forward to a peace which they have won for us.
I remember we rushed up to get the bus into the city. It was absolute chaos. People were very happy, running around and dancing and singing.
There were so many people dancing in front of Flinders Street Station that there were no trams in sight. I remember having to fight my way through the crowds to get home.
I can remember sirens going off all around Fisherman's Bend. Cars, trucks and buses all hooting their horns.
We expected everyone from overseas to come home the next day, of course. Most of them didn't come home for ages.
I can remember climbing on the roof of the house and chalking V for victory, and being surprised that my dad didn't stop me. There was a lot of joy and partying.
I had an absolute ball. There were thousands of people there, all crowded around Prentice Bridge and Flinders Street Station. We laughed, danced, sang, hugged and kissed. It was wonderful.
We weren't told Dad was killed until later. I wasn't told that he was killed in New Guinea until I was about 16. As children, we weren't thinking about it because we had a lot of people around us. I can remember Mum crying and we would give her cuddles, and she'd just tell us she would be okay and to go and play.
I remember going to the Astor Cinema after the war ended, seeing a short newsreel that showed the evacuation of concentration camps in Europe. It was just horrifying. The whole cinema was silent. We just had no idea what had been happening.
My father spent some time in Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital. I remember walking through the wards and seeing all these men doing strange things. Mum would say to me, "Don't stare, they can't help it." There was one man who was always fishing in a bucket of water. My dad would ask him, "Have you caught any fish yet?" And he'd reply, "They're biting, but nothing yet."
The public were urged to turn up in large numbers for the welcome home. I will never forget that day. The vast crowd were completely silent as the first men were carried from the hospital ship at Port Melbourne and conveyed off the wharf by open-doored ambulances. The sight of these men who feebly tried to raise their heads or wave their stick-like arms reduced the great silent crowd to tears. It was very different from the rah-rah reception we envisaged. It is something that my brother and I have never forgotten.
I would visit the beach at Western Port with my grandmother after the war. There were still barbed wire and deep trenches along the beach. I remember finding bird eggs in the trenches. Blue ones.
I can't forget the war years and what it was like for me as a child. It's always on my mind.
Bravo, City of Port Phillip, for that beautifully executed project, which I'm sure we'll watch again and again and share with others. And I'd especially like to thank those who contributed their recollections: Thelma Amers, Marlene Bailey, Mary Baldy, Joan Boyd, Amelia Dukes, Thelma Edgar, Margaret Ewing, Terry Keenan, Elba Kearley, Paul Lynch, Reg Macy, Barbara Patterson, Janet Reville, Kay Rowan, Judy Thompson and Pat Zangiacomi. And now it will be great to hear from Joan Boyd, who'll share with us her reflections about participating in the project. Thank you, Joan.
Oh, hello. I'm Joan Boyd. I live in St Kilda now and I grew up in St Kilda. I remember the wartime years in St Kilda pretty vividly. And I was very interested when I heard about the project that some people were required or requested to participate and tell about their memories. Living in St Kilda, as I still do, there are really memories everywhere. I went to the Brighton Road School, which is now St Kilda Primary. Trenches were all dug up. And we had lots of American soldiers here in 1942, which was not a generally happy time, particularly in Ackland Street and around the pubs. My brother and I were very interested in the aircraft that we saw. We could identify every Australian, American and British plane that we saw. Just recently, with the reaction to a lot of people to the restrictions we've had for the COVID virus, and I can't help comparing it with what it was like during the war. Although we weren't, Victoria, Melbourne, weren't physically attacked, there were lots of ships sunk around Bass Strait and the east coast, which we didn't always hear about till later. And people really suffered. We had all sorts of restrictions apart from the families that had family members fighting overseas, the constant worry of that, the food rationing, just the sort of constant fear. And in a way, it seemed to me very strange that people were so upset about a few social restrictions. I don't know how many people feel like that, but it just came back to me that really as a child, and particularly we had, although it wasn't during the war, we had two very bad polio epidemics in the late 30s and early 50s. So I guess it's just part of getting older and looking back.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you. And now, student Lilly Hall was one of those whose voices we heard on the soundscape. She was inspired to be part of this project because of a family connection. She's also reflected on the impact of the pandemic on Victoria. And now Lilly would like to share her thoughts with us. So welcome to Lilly.
My name is Lilly Hall and I'm from Albert Park College. My voice is one of the student voices you'll be hearing in the Three Children's Eyes soundscape. A couple of weeks before I heard about the soundscape, my grandmother wrote me a letter, on paper. I haven't ever received many letters in my life, probably only about 8, and most of them are from Grandma. My grandma is now 91, and in this letter she told me about her life when she was 14, the same age as I am now. She turned 14 during World War II in Brisbane, where she grew up. In the letter, she told me that there were trenches dug in her school grounds, and each day she had to practice marching from her classroom and then sitting in the dirt in the trenches. The idea was that the trenches would protect the kids if bombs were dropped on Brisbane. As the war progressed and things became more dangerous, the school realised it didn't have enough trenches for everyone, and they weren't sure if they would even be effective. That's when the school changed its schedule. The girls would start at 8 and finish at 12, then the boys would go to school and finish at 4. That way, if a bomb was dropped, all the children would not be killed at once. Some people have said that our COVID lockdown experience is similar to the experience of those who lived through World War II, but after reading Grandma's letter, I know that this isn't really true. What is true is that I'll never forget lockdown in Melbourne, just like my grandma will never forget the war. And one day I'll write a letter to my granddaughter when she's 14. Maybe she'll be living on a different planet or teleporting around the world. Whatever she's doing, I have a feeling that a letter from me in 2097, when I'm 91, will be the first and only letter she'll ever receive.
Thank you so much, Lily. It's so great to hear from you. And I'm sure you'll all join with me in wanting to acknowledge the team at Way Back When Consulting Historians who wrote and curated the soundscape, with sound design by Russell Goldsmith, and just to remember that this was all produced during lockdown, was remote writing, recording and producing, and it's come together in one seamless online product for us all to experience again and again. I'd now like to introduce Lieutenant Colonel Graham Lockwood, OAM, RFD, ED, retired. Graham is a tireless advocate for our community's military history. He was a founding member of the City of Port Phillip's World War I Centenary Commemorative Committee, and he sits on the current World War II Commemoration Committee, and he's on the executive of the Boer War Memorial Association as well. Graham was awarded a Medal of the Order of Australia in the General Division at the Queen's Birthday Awards this year for his service to the community in a range of roles, including his advocacy for the conservation of the City of Port Phillip's monuments and memorials. Graham will now lead us through the ode and a minute's silence. So thank you, Graham.
They went with song to the battle. They were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steadfast and aglow. They were staunch to the end, against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them. Let us observe a minute of silence.
lest we forget.
Lest we forget. This concludes our Remembrance Day event. Thank you all so much for attending, and thanks to all who contributed to the event, and also to all our World War II Commemoration Committee, John Briggs, Jennifer Bryce, Adair Bunnett OAM, Mayor Idelson, Lambus Inglizos AM, Graham Lockwood OAM, Gary March, John May, John Sterling, Ian Tanner and Maureen Walker. And I encourage you all to visit our Remembrance Garden in Port Melbourne. Stop 127 on the 109 light rail service. The poppies are coming out, each one different, each one beautiful, just observes COVID-safe restrictions. I also encourage you to visit the Through Childhood Eyes webpage on the City of Port Phillip website, which has the full transcript of all the interviews you've heard, the audio program, sites of significance in the city, and key dates relating to World War II. And a recording of this event will be available for viewing from next week. There will be other World War II commemorative events over the next few years, so please visit the City of Port Phillip website for further updates. Thank you so much for being part of this event this afternoon, and enjoy the remainder of this beautiful day. Thank you very much.